if you were to go to the city of Prague today and go to the town square of the old part of the city, you would see standing right in the middle a bit of an interesting statue. You see a group of figures clumped together, and out in front you actually see a solitary figure who is leaning forward, looking out over the city square and in some ways looking towards the great church right there in the middle of the town square. That statue, though many tourists don't recognize it, is a statue to Jan Hus. And in this lecture, we're going to look at Jan Hus, and we're going to talk about his reform movement in the area of Bavaria, which is in the modern-day Czech Republic. Jan Hus is an interesting figure. Many have looked to him, particularly in the Protestant world, not because he is valuable on his own, though he is certainly very interesting, and his theology is certainly worth considering from the Protestant perspective. But in 1519, just as Luther's Reformation was underway, he went to Leipzig to have a disputation with the man who would become his nemesis, Eck. And it was there at Leipzig that Luther famously said, out loud for really the first time, Ja, ich bin Hussite, which is German for, yes, I am a Hussite. And the stories we have of the Leipzig disputation tells us that the room really went into pandemonium as a result of Luther uttering these words. We are to believe that so abhorrent is the idea of being a Hussite that when Luther is willing to identify himself with the Hussite movement, that the pious in the audience are taken aback. Well, who was Jan Hus? Jan Hus was a preacher, an academic, the instigator of a religious movement, and he was a forerunner to the Reformation. And just as in the last lecture, as we looked at the writings and the life of John Wycliffe in England, Jan Hus sort of stands in this late medieval tradition of challenging not just the authority of the papacy or the authority of the Roman Catholic Church, but he actually attacks the theological foundations of the Church that even support the papacy or any of the other doctrines of the Middle Ages. Jan Hus was born around 1372. He is, again, very much a late medieval man. And Jan Hus is a humble man. He grows up as just a man of the fields. He's not really all that wealthy. He's not even close to middle class. The city of his birth is actually where he gets his name. The city Husinec actually means goose town, and lots of historians have had a little bit of fun making fun of the fact that Jan Hus really just sort of means Jan the goose. But it was a farming town. It was a livestock town. Hus was very much a man of the people, and the fact that he comes from the everyday stock of the Czech people is actually one of the reasons why, even down until today, his statue stands in the middle of Prague as a symbol of Czech national loyalty. And Hus tells us that though he grew up in relatively meager means, that he actually pursued the priesthood, not, he tells us, because he wanted to achieve any degree of moral sanctity or that he wanted to save his soul or that he had a burden for the people. Rather, he tells us he began to pursue the priesthood because he wanted to have a bit of an easy life. He thought it would give him a bit more attention and fame, and that it would be a way out of a life of goose raising, I suppose. And so in 1390, Jan enrolls at the University of Prague. And the University of Prague really becomes the microcosm of what Jan Hus's Reformation is going to be driven by. At this time, what we today call the Czech Republic was known then as the country of Bohemia. And Bohemia was part of the Holy Roman Empire, that great, vast terrain of elected leadership that was owned for long periods of time by the German peoples. To be the ruler of Germany often meant that you were the Holy Roman Emperor. And Bohemia at this time was ruled by the actual brother of the Holy Roman Emperor. The Holy Roman Emperor was Sigismund, and his brother at the time was head of Bohemia. And being of German stock and seeing Bohemia essentially as another part of the German Empire, the University of Prague became embroiled in many ways in a struggle between the locals, the Czech locals, and the German influence from the Holy Roman Empire that was coming to bear on the University of Prague. We know that there were 4 sub-factions of nationalities there present at the university, and only one of the 4 was actually Czech. We also know that amongst the faculty, it was heavily German. German scholars outweighed other faculty and Czech faculty by sometimes as many as 3 to 1. That number ebbed and flowed. But for the Czech students who were part of the university, they saw the University of Prague as their own. And in fact, Czech students numbered about 50% of the student body. So you can only imagine 50% or slightly more than 50% are Czech, but the faculty is overwhelmingly German, and the focus and the attention was always going towards the German perspective on life and theology, etc. And Huss took his degrees just as the 1300s were coming to a close. He received a BA, and then he received an MA, and we are told that around the year 1400 he is actually finally ordained. He begins to study for his doctorate. He never finished the process of studying for his doctorate. And really the reason he didn't complete his doctoral work is because very quickly Jan Hus was a rising star as a Czech member of the university. In 1402, he is actually named the preacher of the Bethlehem Chapel there in Prague. You can actually still go and see the Bethlehem Chapel to this day. And Jan Hus filled a role that a lot of major urban cities in medieval Europe had, and that was to be a pastor to the lay people. Zwingli, later in the Reformation, fills the same role when he's a Leutpriester. He was a preacher that would preach lay sermons in German, as Zwingli would, to all of the people in Zurich. And Jan Hus is doing the same here in Prague. His job was to preach sermons in Czech to the people, and he drew large audiences that people found his preaching to be inspiring as well as biblical, and that he was a bit of a beacon of hope for the Czech students and for all those who held out the belief that a Czech university, the University of Prague, should be run by Czechs. And here was Jan Hus, a scholar and a preacher who was every bit the epitome of what they wanted. And for whatever reason, whether it is the nationalism of the Czech students or the natural affinity of some of these students to heretical ideas, at some point in the early 1400s, we see a pretty strong rise in interest amongst the students in the teachings of John Wycliffe. Of course, Wycliffe was dead by now, and historians are a bit divided on this. Some believe that it was the tension politically between the Germans and the Czech that caused the Czech to suddenly begin devoting attention to the writings of John Wycliffe. But we have to acknowledge that there is some theological affinity between the biblical vernacular preaching that Jan Hus was doing to the masses, to those gathered in Prague, and the call by Wycliffe to preach biblically, to focus on the message of Scripture, and to rely less and less on some of the theological system of the medieval world. At some point, on or around 1408 or 1409, Jan Hus finally runs afoul of the local archbishop there in Prague. And the Archbishop of Prague actually condemns some of the teachings of Jan Hus. And it would seem that Jan Hus himself was a follower of John Wycliffe, though he was not entirely devoted to everything that Wycliffe taught. And in fact, he was developing some of his own ideas about reform. Whatever the case, finally in 1409, the Pisan Pope, that is, the Pope who was in Pisa during the Great Papal Schism, so only one of the 3, but the Pisan Pope actually sides against Jan Hus. Now, for all we can tell, this seems to be really focused on the teachings of John Wycliffe. It doesn't seem to be per se that they were going after Jan Hus because he was Czech, or that they were going after Jan Hus because he was so overtly a heretic at this point that he needed to be slapped down. Rather, it was the fact that the Wycliffe movement, as we saw in the last lecture, was beginning to gain steam, and that it wasn't dying out, and that it was actually beginning to gain some traction with the Lollards in England, that likely led the Pisan Pope to try to slap it down in Bohemia before it ever got started. And then to back matters up, the Archbishop of Prague again comes and excommunicates Jan Hus just after the Pope has condemned him. Now, this is an interesting point. Huss at this point is excommunicated for disobedience. In other words, he is not yet declared to be a heretic. And we should remember that in the Middle Ages, you could be excommunicated for a lot of things. Often the belief was that excommunication was a warning, at least at the first step, particularly for lesser problems. The church never really believed that excommunication was a permanent fixture, that you were now consigned to hell forever, though, of course, if you died while under excommunication, you would actually spend eternity in hell and not even be afforded the rights to go to purgatory and work your way finally up to heaven. But Huss is excommunicated, and it's telling that he's excommunicated for disobedience to the papacy, that he will not submit to the ruling and the authority of the Archbishop of Prague. All of this, in other words, seems to be done in order to bring Jan Hus to heel, to take the Czech voice and bring him down so that Bohemia can achieve a level of equilibrium. The problem with this, of course, as with any reaction of this kind, both then and now, is as soon as you condemn something without giving it a full chance to be heard, you ultimately propel either that person or that book or that idea onto the world stage. And that's exactly what happened with Jan Hus. To now be declared excommunicated and to have some of his teachings condemned now meant that quite a few, particularly those in Bohemia, the Czech locals, began to look at Jan Hus's teachings with new, fresh energy. And it's actually telling that the goal of the Archbishop of Prague was not necessarily to kill Jan Hus as soon as possible, because even after being excommunicated, Jan Hus still takes to the pulpit at the Bethlehem Chapel there in Prague, and he still preaches his message, just like Luther, who would be condemned about 100 years later. And only after Luther was condemned did he begin to really bolster his language and strengthen it to show what he truly believed about justification. Jan Hus does the exact same thing. Now that he's condemned, now that he's excommunicated, his preaching actually takes on a new inflammatory tone, both against the leadership in Prague as well as the papacy itself. And all of this came to a head in 1411 when the Pope issued another crusading indulgence, that is, another indulgence designed to give lay people a plenary indulgence, that is to say, a full indulgence for all sins committed, for all of the penance that you owed to the Catholic Church in order to escape purgatory and find your way directly to heaven after death. And the indulgence sale in late medieval Europe is increasingly viewed with some suspicion, if not hostility. Most people believed and assumed, and rightly so in many cases, that the crusading indulgences, that the full plenary indulgences that were sold, were not sold so much for the care or the concern of the spiritual well-being of the lay people throughout Europe, but rather they were sold so that those in power could recoup some financial reward and could then apply the funds to whatever project or whatever crusade that they needed funds for. It's with the rise of the sale of indulgences in 1411 that Jan Hus begins to attack the sale of indulgences themselves. Now, again, this sounds very much like Luther just 100 years later. In fact, one of the comments that Jan Hus makes at this point is identical to one that Luther will make 100 years later. Jan Hus points out the fact that if the papacy actually has power over purgatory, and if the papacy can, according to its power, release those who are suffering in purgatory so that they might move on to heaven, why, Jan Hus asks, are we charging money for this? If you have the power, why don't you just simply do it? In fact, that very argument shows up specifically in the 95 Theses with Luther. It seems to have become a bit of a scandalous comment to make about the papacy, which is if you have the power, why are you charging us money for it? That seems extortionate. Jan Hus is excommunicated again. This time it is certainly for the sake of declaring him to be a heretic, to attack indulgences, which is one of the main revenue sources for those in power in the Catholic Church at this time, is, again, just like Luther, to incur some severe wrath from those in power. But Jan Hus was not alone. As his preaching had spread, and as his role as a Czech national who was standing up against those who were in power, both in Rome and in Germany, there actually arose a large number of people who became followers of Hus. We actually see that there were a number of people who began to riot about the sale of indulgences, began to stir up trouble, particularly in Prague. And to Hus's dismay, the sedition was put down, and many of those who had participated in the uprising were beheaded. And Huss at this point decides that he is too much of a firebrand, that his role in Prague is too volatile, and that he does not want to see bloodshed occur because of his name anymore. And so he decides that it is best that he leave his post at the Bethlehem Chapel and move on and go throughout the countryside as opposed to staying in Prague. And that as he goes throughout the countryside, that he will begin to preach and teach and connect with the hoi polloi, the average person out there in the surrounding environs of Bohemia. And again, the harsh tactics with which the Catholic Church attempted to suppress Huss and his followers only began to propel the name of Jan Hus and his followers, who are now increasingly being called the Hussites. It only propelled them further on to the national stage as well as the international stage. As Huss travels, he finds sympathy, he finds supporters. And then as he preaches and makes connections in the surrounding regions of Bohemia, the movement begins to catch fire. It's also while Huss is traveling that he writes his most famous book, which is De Ecclesia, which is translated as On the Church. And in De Ecclesia, Jan Hus lays out some of his vision for what the church ought to be, on the biblical foundation of how the church ought to be run, as well as his view on the sacraments and other doctrines. And it's at this point that we can really notice one of the main doctrines that Jan Hus taught and defended that actually sets him apart from Wycliffe. We noticed in the last lecture that Wycliffe actually still believes in the physical presence of Christ in the Eucharist. The thing that Wycliffe denied was that it was transubstantiated. For Hus, it wasn't so much the physical presence of Christ or the morality or the ethical virtue of the one offering the bread and wine. Rather, for Hus, it was something different. It was actually who gets the wine. You see, in the late Middle Ages, over time, the church had decided that the cup needed to be withheld from the laity. Those of you raised Catholic or those of you who are aware of even modern-day Catholic practice will know that the Mass does not have the wine for lay folks. If you come forward and you're Catholic and you're there for the Mass, you only get the wafer. The cup is reserved, as they say, only for the priesthood. And there are lots of rationales for this. Some are somewhat urban legends. The rise of this idea appears to have come from a number of different avenues. First and foremost, there does seem to be an idea that the cup is more holy. There's something about the blood element of the wine that caused some to see it as a deeper holiness than even the bread and the body of Christ. There are other comments that are made, though, that the wine was at times spilled, or that it was mistreated, that it somehow was unsafe to place a cup of wine even just on the lips of a layperson. And so the theological rationale, the theological argument of keeping the cup away from the laity was a logical deduction, and that logical deduction was that a body has blood in it as well, and therefore if you give the body to the layperson, you're giving them a little bit of blood as well, therefore they are getting both technically, and therefore we can reserve the cup just for the priests. This issue of keeping the cup from the laity is a theological issue for Hus, but it's also symbolic of the things that Hus was standing against. The idea of new traditions, the idea that the clergy is superior to the laity, or that they have sacraments that are just for them, and that the laity just have to only get half of the Lord's Supper or the Mass. And so the view that becomes associated with Jan Hus is called the Utraquist heresy. Utraquist derives from the Latin, which means both. It just means that we want both elements, bread and wine, at the Mass. And so at the end of the day, you have Jan Hus, who is both a national, he very much sees himself as a Czech, as someone who is standing up for the people of his nation, that he wants Bohemia to have its own church, to not be governed by other people, whether it's the Holy Roman Empire or the Pope in Rome. Still, Hus was not the power player in the relationship. And in fact, the Holy Roman Emperor finally got sick and tired of this heretical nuisance in Bohemia, and he called for Jan Hus to come to a council that was being called in 1415, called the Council of Constance. Now, we've already looked at the Council of Constance when we looked at the Papal Schism. Of course, the Council of Constance is the very council where the schism was healed and the Catholic Church was restored. It's also at this council that Jan Hus comes to stand trial. Hus knew what he was up against. The council was going to be hostile. Hus was already excommunicated, he was already condemned, and he was increasingly volatile in his beliefs, and certainly the Utraquist heresy is one of those heresies that the Catholic Church was just not going to hear any debate on. And the Holy Roman Emperor, Sigismund, attempts to offer Jan Hus what's called a safe conduct passage. And a safe conduct passage is a document that an emperor will give somebody or a ruler will give somebody that says, yes, I want to kill you, frankly, but if you come to this event and meet with me, I promise that your life will not be in jeopardy on the way, and often it would be negotiated that on the way back, your life would not be in jeopardy either. Hus decided to take the emperor at his word, and he decided to leave Bohemia before the safe conduct document arrived. He heads to the Council of Constance and he arrives, and shortly after he arrives, the safe conduct does arrive, and unfortunately it wasn't as complete as Jan Hus had requested. So, for example, the safe conduct does not say at any point that Hus will be allowed to defend himself, or that he will be allowed to address the council. It also denied that he would be allowed safe conduct back to Bohemia. Now, the verdict of history on this has always sided with Hus and not with Sigismund. To give a safe conduct passage is only halfway good, that only gives you safe conduct on the way there, but not on the way back, just means that as soon as you set foot heading back, they can just sort of immediately arrest you just outside the city gates, hypothetically at least. Or they could send a band of brigands to sort of off you on the road on the way back. You needed safe conduct both ways for it to even be safe conduct. And so people have always excoriated Sigismund and the Council of Constance for breaking at least the good faith of a safe conduct passage. People are always shocked when Luther is on trial before the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. And Charles V has given Luther a safe conduct passage. And Luther thinks, just like Jan Hus, it's not worth the paper it's written on. And sure enough, Charles V says, no, you can go back. I'm not going to arrest you now. I'll come for you later. And people always sort of scratch their head. It's, you had him, you had him in your hands. Why'd you let him go? But almost certainly there does seem to be some concern by Charles V that he not live down to the legacy of Sigismund in the Catholic Church in the 15th century, who offered safe conduct to a heretic and didn't abide by it. And for Hus, within a month of him arriving at the council, he is arrested. He is not allowed to address the council, which could only have been expected. He is only asked to answer questions. So, for example, he would be asked, is this your teaching? Do you teach this? Is this what you believe? And in some cases, he said no, he did not believe in the things that were alleged to be his ideas. In other cases, though, he was very confident to say, yes, that is what I believe, and I'm willing to defend that. And of course, when you're facing a council and they're giving you the option to say, no, I do not, or that I recant, you really only have one option, either to say, no, I do not teach that, or I do not believe that, or to fully recant. To abide by any of these teachings at this point, Jan Hus knows, everyone knows, is to say that I am condemned, and what is going to happen to me is what you could expect. In July 1415, Hus is brought into the council, and one by one his priestly garments are stripped from him, as they continue to ask him, will you recant? And the answer is no. Of course, this is the symbolic defrocking, which means you're literally removing the garments that signify his priestly or pastoral role as part of the church. And in 1415, condemned, excommunicated, recalcitrant, Jan Hus is burnt at the stake at the Council of Constance. Now, if you think back to all of that preaching in the book that Hus wrote, and the followers that he attracted, and you play that into also the fact that this is a Czech national, a real hero for the Bohemian people, that has now been badly treated at least, if not lied to by the Holy Roman Emperor. What you have now is not just a spark, you have a powder keg that is now on fire and about to explode. And back in Bohemia, that is exactly what happens. The news that Jan Hus had been arrested and then defrocked and then finally burnt at the stake, that his ashes had been scooped up and thrown into the river so that none of his followers would be able to even bury his bones, was beyond the pale for many of Hus's followers. And as a result, they militarized. the Hussite League is formed shortly after the burning of Jan Hus. And in fact, they not only militarize, but they organize. They become a real strong movement that is both galvanized around this injustice that they believe is done to Jan Hus, but as well as around the theological ideas of Hus himself and the heresies that are associated with Wycliffe and other late medieval reformers. In fact, so pronounced is the threat of the Hussite League that in 1418 the Pope actually calls, now at this point of course it's the restored Martin V, now that the papal schism is ended. But in 1418 Martin V calls a crusade against the Hussites. And this, however, only leads to further rioting in the city of Prague. A year later, 1419, you have what's known as the defenestration of Prague, which is a bit of a play on words there, because defenestration literally means out the window. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. The Hussites stormed the main administrative building, they grabbed the rulers of the city, and they threw them out the window, and they died either by hitting the ground from a tall height, or the mob finished them off when they hit the ground and were maimed and wounded there. And the defenestration of Prague is considered one of these watershed moments for the Hussite Church, because it was the first time they stood up, not just theologically for themselves, but now politically. They stood up against these German rulers in the city of Prague who were trying to impose papal and traditional religion on them when they were not willing to accept it. And so good was the Hussite League at forming its own unity and organizing, and at the tactics of war against those who were trying to suppress them, that actually the Hussites won, to the astonishment of everyone, historians included. In 1420, the Hussites win, and a certain level of peaceful cooperation is imposed on Bohemia, that from 1420 on, at least well into the 17th century, the Hussite movement continues, and it lives alongside the Catholic Church and Catholic adherents to the faith in the same country. And this is why there are many people who believe that Bohemia really is the first Protestant nation. It has seceded from the Catholic Church, this whole wing, and it achieves a level of recognition from the Catholic Church, who essentially realize at some point that they can devote all kinds of resources and troops in effort to suppress this heresy, but the more they try to suppress it, the quicker it grows. Now, one of the last things theologically to say about the Hussites is they were not united theologically. The very reality is that Jan Hus's theology was not actually all that well developed. His Utraquist beliefs did not really challenge or bring up anything about the doctrines of salvation. His attack on indulgences was more about, again, the abuse of indulgences than it was on the actual belief in whether or not indulgences were valid at all. Utraquism, in other words, is not really much to make a church out of. Once you have communion in both kinds, you still have to describe what it is, what it's there for, what its role is in salvation, and all these other doctrines that are significantly important for determining the belief of your church. And in fact, one of the first things to develop in the Hussite movement is you have a split theologically. In the Hussite church, the folks that would be called the Utraquist church are, by any account, the moderates. They are those who really adhere to Jan Hus directly, at least as a forerunner or figure to sort of inspire them. Their focus is on the Utraquism doctrines of communion in both kinds. They want churches that are autonomous in their own way, but they are moderate. Their goal is not to throw everything out that is Catholic, but rather to get the Catholic Church to get off their back. There's another group of Hussites, though, and they're called the Taborites. And the Taborites are an entirely different band of weirdos. The Taborites are what we call millenarian. They are hyper-eschatological. They take the name Tabor from the mountain in Israel where Christ is supposed to return when he comes back again. The Taborites focus a great deal on the second coming, on whether or not it's imminent, what will happen afterwards. And as is unfortunate with lots of millenarian movements, a lot of the activities and the beliefs and the actions of the Taborites just get a little strange. Actually, they don't get a little strange. They get a lot strange. They are, frankly, crazy. Let's just put it that way. At some point, they decide to practice what we might today call free love. the sharing of partners. They were communist in the modern sense of the word. They wanted to share everything. They didn't want to just share their own goods. They wanted everyone else's goods to be shared as well. And that was one of their main rallying cries, is the redistribution of wealth amongst Bohemia. And they were pretty blatantly anarchical. They just wanted to incite sedition. I guess after the free love was over, it was time to do some fighting. So anybody that they could fight on behalf of the Taborite movement, they would do so. And so eventually the Taborites become a pox on the Utraquists themselves. And in fact, the Utraquists eventually began to sort of get in talks with the Catholic Church in efforts to try to figure out a way to deal with these crazy people. At the end of the day, the legacy of Jan Hus and the Hussites would be smaller if it weren't for the fact that in about 100 years after his death, and certainly within 100 years of the success of the Hussite League, you have arise the Protestant Reformation. That Luther himself, in 1519 at the Leipzig Disputation, decides to wrap his own Reformation up with that of Jan Hus. Notice he doesn't make any appeal to Wycliffe. The Lollards and the Wycliffe movement, as we've already seen, did not have the political strength and the effect that the Hussite League and the Hussite Church managed to achieve in Bohemia. And it is really because of the success of later Protestantism that Jan Hus and his image in the Hussite Church has endured in our minds, not just as an interesting theological radical during the Middle Ages, but in many ways as a forerunner to the Reformation